I'm going to show you these three patterns. I'm going to move along, I hope, more quickly, because we don't want to crowd out the bull session and all the rest of that in the pit. But as I said, one of my goals here is to try to paint a picture for you that sort of contra Richard, even though the truth lies in between. You look at the history of life with eyes like mine, and you can't help but think that almost nothing happens without direct environmental instigation. So if anything, just to counteract Richard, I would say that the evolution, the environment is what drives evolution rather than the genes. Of course, it's an interaction between the two, and I'm going to try to sort of paint a picture about how that really works. But let me just say, for about 2 minutes, and I have a tendency to warm to this too much, and it's when I was a kid in school in the 60s, we knew almost nothing about Precambrian paleontology. I mean, the big fossils that you find in the fossil record began at the base of the Cambrian. Darwin knew about them, and they were trilobites. I'll show you a picture of one in a moment. And very little was known from those rocks that were older than those Cambrian rocks that had the fossils in them, although people suspected that a great deal of time was there and knew that there must be some kind of life in them. And in fact, soon after Darwin established the notion of evolution, people realized the most primitive things around are microorganisms, and they got to be back there someplace. And there's been a tremendous explosion in knowledge in the fossil record from, well, what we sort of loosely call the Precambrian. The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. The oldest rocks are about 4 billion years old. They are granites. I can't remember where they are right now, whether they're in Greenland or Australia. People keep finding new candidates for the oldest rocks. But these are igneous rocks. They will not have, by their very nature, remains of organisms in them. They can't. They're solidified out of a molten mass. Soon as you find rocks that are sedimentary, that are formed from particles that were deposited in bodies of water, like lakes or ocean basins or what have you, you find fossils. I think that that's incredible. I think that the idea that Earth is basically, life is basically intrinsic to Earth comes from this notion. Who knows how old really life is? Okay, oldest body fossils about 3.5 billion years old. As you would predict, they are very tiny, simple, real microscopic bacteria. They're just rods, okay? But you can see that that's what they are. Somebody recently published a paper in the last year or two saying that there's biochemical evidence, there's kinds of forms of carbon that are only known from living systems. So they're not inorganic forms of carbon. Organic forms of carbon actually maybe go back to about 3.8 billion years. Now, I'm going to suggest this and then two other very rapidly points where knowledge is accumulating. I'm not going to insist on the truth of this, and I'm certainly not going to say that coincidence proves causality. But we do have, 3.8 billion years ago, evidence on the moon and also on the Earth now of a tremendous outer space bolide impact, multiple bolide impacts, whether they were comets or asteroids. Why is that important? Now people are thinking, when I was a student, I was taught that most of the water on Earth probably came from the outgassing from volcanoes. Now people are thinking that maybe it was all from cometary impact. And no less a personage than Crick himself thinks that perhaps life came from elsewhere. I think that that's probably just pushing the problem back one step. I'm not a big fan of that, but it's possible that life actually came in with these comets, and certainly it's very possible that all the water, which is necessary, obviously, to have life on Earth, most of our water came in this particular impact. And bingo, those are our oldest fossils. All right, it's a coincidence. Is it a cause and effect? Who knows? Some people think it might have even been the first mass extinction. How are you going to figure that one out? I don't know. These are problems, though, that were never even adumbrated. They were just, people had no clue that these might be interesting ways of thinking about things, even as much as 10 years ago. So I'm very excited about that. First complex body fossil. Let me take a drink. First complex cellular life evidence is still about 2.2 billion years, as far as I know. This means the kind of cells that are in our bodies and fungal bodies, in plant tissues, and also some of the more complex microbial organisms, non-bacterial. In other words, the DNA is housed in the nuclei inside the cells. Good evidence for that, at least 2.2 billion years old, and they might go back slightly further, but back around that time, I was astonished. I was at a conference sort of like this one, in Japan about 5 years ago, and a guy named Joe Kirschvig from Caltech was there. And this is the first I'd ever heard of this, but he had just published a paper in Science or Nature, one of those places, august and sincere places, that that showed the data underlying his interpretation and his colleagues that the Earth, around 2.2 billion years ago, was glaciated so heavily that the glacial sheets reached all the way down to the equator, and in effect, the Earth became a snowball. It's called the snowball Earth hypothesis. And there's a man at Harvard, Paul Hoffman, in the geology department. I went up there to give a talk a couple of years ago, and he grabbed me and he sat me down and he asked me to speculate about what the impact of such a snowballization, if you will, of the crust of the Earth, the external crust of the Earth, would have on life. And I said, well, I'm not that kind of a biologist. I'm certainly not a microbiologist, and that's all you had going on back then. But yeah, it's just amazing. And then he started spouting a lot of chemistry and everything at me, and I was just dumbfounded. And I said, well, I don't know, but yes, one could readily imagine that this would have a major impact on the history of life, or at least on the living systems at that point, and probably subsequently on the subsequent history of life. Did that kind of event underlay the appearance of the eukaryotic cell? I don't know. But there again, we have a sort of a correlation going on that may tell us a little bit down the line about when and why, or why anyway, or under what conditions, more complex cellular forms of life appeared on Earth. Then we have the Cambrian explosion. Kirschvig thinks that, and Hoffman's involved with this too, that between about 0.8 billion, so 800 million to 600 million years ago, there may be as many as 4 episodes of snowball Earth going on. Kirschvig also thinks that the crust rotated 90 degrees. I mean, bizarre things happening on the Earth right then. There's also the notion that there was insufficient oxygen dissolved in seawater. This goes back, this is the Berkner and Marshall hypothesis. The idea goes back 30, 40 years now. So it was current when I was a student. That there was insufficient oxygen dissolved in seawater to support larger forms of life. So this Cambrian explosion might have been consequent to any one of a number of physical things that were going on Earth. I'm particularly enamored with the possibility that I love looking at evolution, because it seems like nothing happens for a long time, but as soon as the conditions are right for something to happen, nature doesn't wait around. Nature abhors a vacuum in many respects, and one of them is in the evolutionary sense. If the ingredients are there, it's going to happen. The big mystery is why things for so long tend not to happen. I mean, after all, we had bacteria from, and this, I should have explained what this is. This is a stromatolite. This is a blue-green alga. It's about 600 million years old. It's from Saratoga, New York. Samuel Johnson were here, he would have refuted it thus by kicking, at least it's a rock. I mean, this thing is a big thing. It's wonderful because things like this are still being formed in Shark Bay, in Australia, and a few other places. They're called blue-green algae, but they're really bacteria, filamentous. They come up every day. They're photosynthesizing. They make a layer. They trap sediment, and the whole thing dies down when the sun sets, and then the whole process starts the next day. So they build up these big, in effect, they're colonies. You could see these in rocks that are almost 3 billion years old in various parts of the world. It's the only sort of macroscopic life that you could see. The rest, and there, of course, they are bacteria, but there are zillions of them forming these big colonies.